Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Frank here. This video is going to be a little different. We're going to switch it up some. I'm going to do some woodworking for a change. I've got a project for a friend. She wants a trophy shelf. This is for her adult son who is I think he's a high school athletics coach or director. In any case, he's got a collection of trophies, some signed baseballs, some ribbons. So we're going to make a relatively simple little shelf. It'll approximately 12 by 24, about a foot from top to bottom and 24 inches wide. So small enough to fit, you know, most anywhere, hung on a wall. I have to think about the best way to hang it. I have some special hangers I might use. So woodworking has been my lifelong serious hobby. I'll stick some pictures up here of some of my furniture projects. I started woodworking, I don't know, I was a kid. I mean, I can remember getting a Power King, I think that's what it was called, lathe for Christmas, a child battery operated wood lathe. It actually turned styrofoam. But I bought a jigsaw from a yard sale, a little electric jigsaw, and I made stuff out of that. I was probably 10 or 12 years old. My father was a do-it-yourselfer, and so I probably inherited some of that interest from him. I've been a woodworker for all of my adult life, and my foray into metalworking is a recent thing, because I've run out of room for furniture in my house and my children's houses, and done projects for all of them. And you know, I feel like I have accomplished, you know, quite a bit in terms of woodworking skill, developing skills, and you'll see from some of the pictures, I think, will bear that out. So this is just something I'm doing for a friend. I'm going to show you. I mean, I have a huge supply of lumber here. Not only is there a big pile on the floor down here, it's quite a pile, and most of the stuff on the floor is 6/8, 10, 12 quarter cherry and walnut, and almost all of this is cherry or walnut, black walnut and American black cherry. And so this is my stockpile. I've had this lumber this is what's left of a massive purchase some 15 years ago, where I purchased a huge 2 tandem trailer, the flatbed trailers. I have a flatbed trailer that I move tractors around on and stuff, 18-foot trailer, filled it up twice. So it was a huge load of cherry and walnut. I stickered it in my barn, and it sat there for 5 years before I used any of it. I had, you know, previous supply I was working through, started moving it into my shop and started building furniture with it, and you know, completed quite a few projects with it. But I still have this, you know, pretty large stockpile left over. If you can see, you know, the number of boards here in this pile, and you know, the pile down here on the floor. I've had to add a metal shelf here, as you'll notice. So I've picked through my stash and pulled out a couple of boards. This is looks about a 1x8 walnut, approximately 1x8 rough cut walnut. And then I've got another board over here that I haven't brought over yet. This is I don't know, I think it's about a 1x5 or 6, 10-foot long board. And so I'm going to start with these 2 boards, and I'm going to share with you the process I go through in terms of working on a project such as this. The first thing I do is I call it get out the lumber. And that is to go through the pile of lumber. And if you're going to a lumber yard, you know, you take a list of the dimensions of lumber you need and you pick out the boards from their pile of boards. This lumber, if you go to a lumber yard, is very expensive, $10, $12 a board foot. A board foot being 12-inch wide, 12 inches long, 1 inch thick. I paid a tiny fraction of that. I think when I bought this pile, I think I paid 80 cents a board foot for it, and it was over 2,000 board feet. Anyway, getting out the lumber is the first step, and it's picking some boards from the pile that will have enough material in them for the project, sorting, looking at them. And in a larger project, you're going to have, you know, a pile of boards, and you kind of have to go through your list, your cut list, your list of pieces that you need. In this case, it's a shelf unit with a back board and a couple of short shelves on it, so it's relatively straightforward. I know I need something about 12 or 15 inches by 24, 25 inches, allowing some waste at each end for checking if the boards have checks in them or cracks in the end grain, and sort through the boards and decide what you want to do. And the first thing I do is cut them to rough length. And so I'm at my miter saw here. This is a 12-inch Hitachi sliding compound miter saw, and it has largely replaced, or for me, it has totally replaced what I used to use. Was a radial arm saw purchased that my first saw was a radial arm saw that I purchased right after I got out of college. My first power tool, it was a Sears Craftsman radial arm saw that I took about 5 or 6 years ago when I moved to this shop 5 years ago from my previous shop. I took that to the dump and put it in the help yourself pile. I mean, it was a nice radial arm saw, been upgraded, had a nice table, but really didn't use it anymore. The sliding compound miter saw just has totally replaced the radial arm saw for crosscuts. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I've got this board. It's 10 feet long. I'm going to cut a couple sections out of it. It does have a crook down at this end right here. So 2 cuts, one here will give me a straight piece about 18 inches long, and then another cut here, and the bent part here. And generally the bends are caused by a limb or some other stress in the lumber when it's milled. In this case, there was probably, looks like a limb was here in the lumber, so that causes differential drying and will cause the board to warp slightly. And since these are from the sawmill, these are rough, and when you buy lumber from the sawmill, in my case I bought it all green and dried it myself, you're going to get a variety. You know, you're not going to get the quality of lumber that you would get if you went to a mill workshop and bought the lumber. Of course, you pay for it. So I've never had any problem using lumber like this. I can cut around any defects. I found that works fine, and I don't really waste much material. You always need small parts, and so if you save the larger pieces that you cut off, you can get small parts out of them. So this is what I'm working with. I'm going to cut this board into several lengths. I'm going to leave 2 or 3 inches extra on each end of the board because I'm going to run it through the planer. I'm going to leave it a little bit, the back board, the backboard for the shelving unit that goes against the wall will be a glue up of several narrower boards. After I glue it up, I'm going to run it through the planer to level it out, smooth it out, give a nice surface finish to it. So I'm going to leave it a little bit thick for the glue up. I'll probably plane it to 7/8 or 13/16, and then the final pass after it's been glued up, we'll bring it down to 3/4 of an inch. So I'll cut a couple pieces out here, and then I'll get the other board and we'll cut a couple sections out of that. And that's my process for getting the wood out, so as I call it. The next step will be milling to dimension, to rough dimension. So that's the process. I get the wood out, cutting it, pulling the boards, cutting them to rough lengths for the parts I need, then milling to rough dimension, then glue ups or other machining process, and then milling to final dimension, and then assembly and finishing. So first step, getting the wood out. So this is the board I plan to use to make the back. Cut it almost 60 inches long. It'll be cut in half and then glued up edge to edge. It's 8 inches, almost 8 inches wide. So we'll lose a little bit when we mill the edges straight and parallel, but this will give us the stock we need for the back. You always want to look, now since this is walnut, now if you can see here in the camera, a little bit of sapwood along this edge, but it disappears by the time you get to this side. So we will favor this other side. If we want to trim anything off, we'll trim it off over here. The lumber industry doesn't consider sapwood in walnut a defect. So when they grade boards, they don't reduce the grade based on some sapwood. I never use sapwood. If I have walnut, I cut the sapwood out. I never use sapwood on my projects, in my projects. I'm fortunate that I have such a large supply of lumber that I can be picky like that. All right, so this is the first board. I'm going to get the other board that we'll be using for shelving, for the shelves. Here's the second board I pulled from the pile. It has a little, it's actually a pretty straight board. It does have a little crook in it, but that won't make any difference. There's a little curve here, so I'm going to cut it here. This section to the other end is quite flat. There is a little stress point here that has a lot of grain that's causing the board to twist a little bit here. So, and there's a little knot right here. Otherwise, the board is in pretty good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it at this one spot here where it has a little bit of bend in it. I'll get a flat section over here, and then this will be flat basically for its entire length. I am going to avoid this little piece right here. because of its tight grain. It looks like it probably had a limb right there. All right, so we'll cut a couple pieces out of this. I'm going to do, since the shelf is roughly 24 inches wide, the plan is to have 3 shelves about halfway across, one at the top, one on the other side halfway down, one on the bottom. We'll see what I come up with. She gave me an idea of what she's looking for. I asked her if I had some creative license, and she said yes. So we'll see how this turns out. But I'll make a couple cuts here so we can get some. We'll be able to mill square and flat lumber out of this piece. That gives me the 2 pieces of stock that I need. I'll make the shelves out of this, and I'll make the back out of this board. And of course it leaves me with several cut-offs that I can use for other stuff. Still good lumber. All right, so the next step is to mill to rough dimensions. All right, back in the shop this morning, working on the trophy shelf. Last time we were in here, we were talking about my process for a woodworking project. The first step is to get the wood out or get the lumber out, and that's to go through the wood pile and select boards appropriate for the cut list, the pieces that we need. Then milling to rough dimension, which then includes, cutting to length the boards we need, and then surfacing, cutting them to closer to final size, then milling to final dimension, 3rd step. Fourth step is assembly, and then finishing. We cut the boards already to rough length and allowing some excess for waste. And I've got the 2 boards here on the saw, and the first thing we're going to do is get them to approximate thickness. I'm going to run them through the planer. There are times when you have to joint them first to get a flat surface. If the dimensions for the item are critical in terms of straightness and flatness, then it's always best to joint one side first on the joiner and then plane them to get the other side parallel, flat and parallel. Sometimes I do that. I don't think I need to do that for these boards. They're pretty good shape already. And since this is just a simple shelf, I don't have close tolerances on joints and that sort of thing, so I don't need, perfection on the dimensions of the lumber. If you're building drawers or casework, furniture, then it's a different story, and you do need flat, parallel, true surfaces. So we don't need to worry so much about that for this project. So the first step is to run these boards through the planer to get them to approximate thickness. One of the boards, the wider board, will be glued up, cut in half, and then glued up, and then we'll run it through the planer again, which will, after the glue is dried, to flatten the final piece. Now, we haven't talked about the actual design or dimensions of the shelf unit. I'm still mulling around in my head. I do know the approximate size, so I'm going to wind up with a panel which is 16 by 15 by 25 or 28, something like that, maybe 30 inches. At that point, we'll look at the actual design, make some decisions on what we're going to do as far as the main panel, and then the shelves. I've gotten pretty specific instructions on what the shelves should look like, so that will help there. It's already kind of made those design decisions for us. So let's run the lumber through the planer, see what the boards look like. It's tough to tell what the figure and the grain looks like when they're rough because it's largely obscured by the rough surface. You can tell generally what it looks like, but we'll see what the boards look like after we run them through the planer one time. The planer is exceedingly loud. So I've got the boards, first pass on surfacing them. It gives me a better idea of what the grain looks like. That's a nice board. This one's got a lot more. This board has a few issues. It's got what looks like crotch grain right here probably from a limb. This section's good, and then from here, this section's pretty good. I would avoid this area here because of the tree branch that came out of the log at this point. And there's a knot right here as well. So this particular board has a few issues that need to work around. I'm going to run another board through the planer just so make sure I have enough stock. So this other board, this is actually a pretty nice board. So okay, so we've got all of the boards surfaced to surfaced oversize. They're surfaced to, these are 7/8 of an inch. Now we're ultimately going to go to 3/4, so we have, well, not quite 7/8, but close to it. Yeah, 7/8. So we've got 1/8 of an inch to take off. So before we finish, we'll cut a 16th, we'll plane a 16th inch off of each side. When you plane lumber, you want to try to plane the same amount off of each side, so that if there's, you don't want differential moisture content. You don't want, when the wood dries, it is drier on the outside, obviously, than on the inside. If you plane more on one side, you expose more moisture in the lumber on one side than on the other. And when that evaporates to reach equilibrium in the shop, then you can get differential movement of the wood and cause the lumber to cup or move. Let's check the moisture content on these boards. Knowing the moisture content of your lumber is important. If you're buying it from a hardwood lumber supplier, it's going to all be kiln dried, and it's going to be under 10%, depending on how it's stored. It reaches equilibrium with the environment that it's stored in. They'll generally dry it to 6%, 6 or 8%. And there is a characteristic of lumber called hysteresis. It's a tendency to stay the way it is, resist change. So if it's dried to 6%, its equilibrium is going to be lower than air-dried lumber in the same environment. So that's the advantage of having kiln-dried lumber. It's going to be lower moisture content than air-dried lumber. This is all air-dried lumber. The advantage of air-dried lumber is its color is usually more vibrant, and especially with walnut or cherry, I think it looks better air-dried. Kiln-dried lumber, especially lumber dried in steam kilns, kiln-dried lumber, walnut, other figured hardwoods, tend to change color in the drying process. Air-dried lumber retains its color, and I think air-dried lumber is what I generally use. Now this has been stored for years in the workshop, and it says 8%, which is pretty good for air-dried lumber. Of course, it's been in my workshop here, which is air-conditioned and heated, so the advantage of having dry lumber, obviously, over wet lumber is that when you take it into the house, and this is especially true of furniture where you have drawers or doors, if the moisture content is too high when you build something and you take it in the house, which in the winter can be very dry with indoor heating, central heating causes a relative humidity to drop to very low levels in the house in the winter, dries out the lumber and can cause shrinkage. Well, it will cause shrinkage, but it can also cause, when it shrinks, warping or problems with, components fitting together properly. In the summer, then, you get high moisture content, not so much today with air-conditioned homes, but if you do get it in a moister environment, a more humid environment, then you get swelling. And if the drawers are not fitted properly, then the drawers start sticking and the doors don't close, and so you have other issues. So it's best to have good dry lumber under 10% moisture content, and the lower the better. It's almost impossible to get much below 6 or 8% in the normal workshop environment, because the wood's going to absorb moisture even if you dry it more than that. Okay, The boards are milled, surfaced to oversize so that we can go to the next step, which is decide on the actual design of the shelving unit, so we know what we need to glue up. I do know that I'm going to take this wider board here, cut it in half basically in the middle, and then glue it edge to edge. And when we do the glue up, we'll have to deal with we'll clean up these edges. We'll joint the edges. This side of the board looks great. This side, there's a little bit of sapwood here, and interesting, a little bit of insect damage. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, you can, the little worm holes. So this log was probably, and this is in the sapwood more than the heartwood. This tree was probably either dead, standing dead, or on the ground for some period of time before it was milled. But it's a nice looking board. Let's pull out the pencil and paper and make some decisions on what this is ultimately going to look like. You're going to be exposed here to my thought process, which may be a little bit embarrassing for me, but I often work from detailed plans. But there are times we'll kind of make up the plans as we go along. So let's go through that process. This is what my friend had asked for, was a rectangular shelf unit with a couple of short shelves staggered, and then a longer shelf at the bottom, and then room underneath for some hooks or dowels to stick out so that can hang ribbons on. Okay, so that's basically what she asked for. And of course, I mean, that would work fine. We could easily do that. My thought is, that's pretty square. So I was kind of looking at different, this is the square one face on. Could round the corners, round them more, maybe make an oval. Put a curve on the top, put a curve on the top and the bottom. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Trying to keep as close to this design because she has specific dimensions she's looking for. I think I'm going to do, this just looks too plain for me. So I think I'm going to do, because I need to have dowels coming out of the bottom for hanging ribbons on, I think the bottom should be straight, and then just to add some visual interest, we'll put a curve on the top. These shelves are staggered so that you can set a trophy, set trophies on them and they'll stick up. And then she wants room for, some signed baseballs and a way to retain them. So we'll either drill a small hole, like a 1.5-inch diameter shallow hole, so the baseball would sit on that as a way to hold them. She also wants a groove across the back edge, near the back edge, for standing up a plaque or a plate or something like that. So we'll do the grooves across all three shelves. And since this is just holding some lightweight stuff, I think it's going to be adequate to just thinking about the best way to attach the shelves to the back. I mean, we can either screw from behind into them, which would be plenty strong. We'll put some glue on the joint and screw from behind. There's other ways to do it. One other way would be a dovetail joint, where this is the back, and you would cut a dovetail in the back and then slide the shelf, cut a dovetail on the end of a shelf, and the shelf would fit in there, slide into that dovetail. The only problem with that is it leaves an exposed joint here on the ends. So I think the best way is just going to be shelf, butt joint, screws, and glue it and put some screws through it, and that should be plenty strong. For holding a couple of trophies, it's not like they're Stanley Cup size trophies. They're small high school type trophies. Okay, so next step then is to glue up this one larger board, cut it in half, and glue and clamp it to make a panel that will eventually cut the top curve in and square it up. That switch is for the vacuum, for the miter saw. All right, next step is to true up these edges. We want to get a straight, flat edge which is perpendicular to the face. Do that on the jointer. So you'll hear me turn on the dust extraction system. And that's connected to all the tools. There's a blast gate which opens the suction to the particular tools. So you'll hear that come on as I use each tool. When you're gluing up a larger panel from smaller boards, it's a good idea to lay them out and look at your choices as far as figure or grain pattern is concerned. Don't have a whole lot of choice on these boards. These are the two best faces. So the way the grain at the joint here is straight is probably the most important thing to consider. You want the joint to disappear. So the grain is almost identical on both sides of the joint. So when this gets glued up, this joint should essentially disappear. And that's probably the most important consideration. You don't want wildly different grain patterns on opposite sides of a glue joint. It'll stand out, pretty dramatically. Okay, so I'm just going to put some glue and clamp these boards up. You want just a small bead of glue squeeze out at the joint. A lot of glue just makes a big mess. You don't need it, and you don't need to over tighten the joints, just enough to bring the joint together. We'll let that glue up dry, and then we'll come back later and mill it to final dimension. So I think this is the arrangement for the shelves. I will route the edges of all the shelves and of the backboard as well. Finished up last night milling the shelves and the panel to final dimension. Here's a quick look at what we have. The panel routed a small cove in it just to give the edge a little interest. The shelves all have a Roman ogee milled into the lower side, lower edge, and then I've also milled a groove, stop groove, on each of the boards, and that's to catch the edge of a little plaque or dish or whatever, and it's something that was requested, is that we provide that. The next thing is to decide how to attach the boards to the panel, and there's about 50 ways to do that. One way I've considered is biscuit joinery, which would be relatively simple to do. I'm thinking I may go a step further here and incorporate mortise and tenon joints, and that is to make, since these shelves are literally cantilevered from the panel, if this were to fall, drop off the wall for some reason, and hit the floor with trophies and stuff on it, the shelves would be, if we used biscuit joinery, the shelves I think might break off. The biscuits are good in tension, but not so good in against bending, which is the kind of stresses that would be put on this panel. If it were to hit it, it might break this way. So I think there's no way to make it impervious to all possible hazards, but you want to consider the way items are used and make sure that the joints stand up to any stresses that might generally be expected, maybe in a worst case kind of scenario. So I think what we're going to do is mortise and tenons, and the way I'm going to do that is we will route a groove in the panel, It doesn't need to be very deep, probably only, maybe a little over 1/4 of an inch deep. And then on the back edge of each shelf, we will make a tenon or cutaway material. So there's a stub which sticks out, which would then glue into those grooves. The other thing I did before I left the shop last night was stain the pegs. I don't know exactly how many I'm going to use on the shelf here, but I went ahead and stained them with walnut stain. So, I mean, you can see there, these are probably birch or maple. And we'll drill 1/2 inch diameter holes there and set these pegs in. And I'm thinking, 5 or 7. I stained 8 to have an extra one. So they look dark now compared to the wood, but when the wood gets finished, it will get much darker. So it'll be a closer match when we apply the finish to the shelf. Let's take some measurements, lay out for the grooves, and then we'll take it back to the router table and route the grooves. The grooves are not going to go all the way to the edge. They'll be, like for this shelf, I might have a groove 6 inches long or 8 inches long, and maybe 10 inches for this one, and this one might be 18 inches long, something like that. All right, well, let's do some layout. I spent some time with the rule and pencil and paper, and I think I figured out that the best spacing is 3 3/4 between the shelves. A baseball is 3 inches in diameter, plus or minus a couple millimeters. So 3 3/4 will give room for a baseball anywhere in here, plus an extra 3/4 of an inch if you put a little ring stand under it or something. And it doesn't get too close to the top. I was concerned about this board being too close to the top. I think at 3 3/4 spacing is good. That leaves me an inch and a half at the bottom, which is plenty of room to put some of these pegs in for hanging ribbons. Okay, so that gives me the 3 dimensions I need spaced from the bottom for the lower edge of the groove we're going to mill in here. 1 3/4, 6 1/4, and for the top one, 10 3/4. We're going to mill the grooves, going to stop them 2 inches from the ends, and mill a groove here, the full length, mill a shorter groove here, and then a medium-sized groove up here for the top shelf. And we'll use the router table with a 1/4 inch straight bit, and we'll mill the grooves about 3/8 of an inch deep. I've put some blue painter's tape on the fence and marked it with locations for where I'm going to set the board down and pick the board up or stop the cut. So I've got mark up here, 2 inches on either side of the bit. So for the first cut, and it's spaced an inch and 3/4, which is my first dimension. So this one will run from 2 inches in here to 2 inches in here. So I'll start it there and end it there. The next one starts in the same spot and ends at the mark up here. And the last one starts at the mark up there and ends at the mark here. So I've got that all figured out. Of course, it'll be different spacings for each one. We'll make the first cut. We'll make the first cut for the bottom groove. I have fastened an auxiliary fence. This is a piece of maple, actually it's left over from a cabinet install, and spaced it away from the blade so that it will cut 5/16 of an inch in and approximately 1/4 of an inch deep. So that's a near perfect fit. Of course, that goes in that groove. This one goes in there. This one goes in there. So that's a nice slip fit. There's no play. Okay. So the next thing is to go ahead and trim several inches of the tenon off the end of each board. All right, so that's the dry fit up complete. We need to sand it and drill the holes for the pegs. There's actually very little sanding required. I'm basically just breaking the edges so they're not sharp, and a light sanding. One more shelf to glue up here. I've already glued up the bottom and the middle shelf. Last shelf is the top one. Fits like that. I'll show you my gluing technique. One of the mistakes a lot of beginning woodworkers make is using too much glue, and they wind up getting it squeezed out all over the place, and then they got to wipe it up with a rag, or I mean, it makes a big mess. So I'll show you my gluing glue application technique. Okay. Just get the rest of the dust out of there. Okay, so you don't need a lot of glue. All right, so because this is basically a mortise and tenon, I put a thin bead along the top edge on each side of the mortise, or in this case a dado, so when the tenon goes in there, it pulls that glue down into the joint. The other surface area, a little bit of glue here, a little bit of glue here, and then on the surface that will, see, it's just a tiny, very thin bead, because that will squeeze out to cover all of the contact area, and there may be just the tiniest bit of, make sure that's flush. Okay. A couple of hand screws. Apply some pressure. Check the shelf for square. Alright, that's square. If your surfaces are square, when you clamp something together, it's going to have a tendency to go square, stay square. But if your clamps are not clamping in a straight line, then you can pull the joint out of square. Okay. The shelf is square. Add some weight to keep this. Since I have the panel cantilevered over the bench and all the weight of these clamps on here, it would tend to flip it off. So I've put a couple things over here as weight. You'll see I do have one little spot of glue coming out here, so I would need to clean that up, but that's, you know, about the most you ever want to see. You don't need gobs of glue. You don't need gobs of glue. The glue joint is stronger than the wood itself, and just a very thin layer of glue. If your joints fit well, you don't need glue to take up the space. So we'll let that dry. That's the third shelf. So once that's dry, we'll come back and apply a finish. Touch up any sanding maybe, and hit it with some, I think I'm going to use a wiping varnish. I think I have some wiping varnish. I like Minwax brand wiping varnish. It's easy to apply and does a nice job. So we'll come back and do that tomorrow. All right, we're going to finish up this trophy shelf project. I've got one coat of wipe-on poly on it. We're going to do another coat right now. And when I talked to my friend today, she said, "Hey, how about doing..." When I talked to my friend today, she said, "How about doing another small shelf for this guy's wife?" So I did this today. It's just a single shelf. I do think I'm going to go ahead and put the pegs along the bottom like I have on here. Got the pegs installed, and I'm going to go ahead and put a second coat of wipe-on poly. This is what I like to use. This is, and I have no affiliation with this company or anything, Minwax. I like all their products. I use their stains, and I use their varnish, and I use this. This is wipe-on poly. This is a clear gloss. I use a satin or semi-gloss as well. But this is so easy to use. You don't even use a brush. I just use a little piece of a rag. This is a piece of terry cloth. I wear gloves, and then just pour some of the wipe-on poly, and it's basically just thinned down varnish. And then just use the rag to wipe it on, get a nice even coat. And depending on what you're trying to do, if it's a piece of furniture that's going to have glasses and stuff set on it, then I tend to shy away from wipe-on poly because it's thin, it soaks in, it leaves a natural grain finish. It doesn't give you a thick plastic like protective finish that you would get with a regular varnish that you would brush on. So for like a coffee table or an end table or something, I would use a brush on varnish, at least for the top surface. For stuff like this, shelves or other furniture that's not getting a lot of use, about 3 or 4 coats of this will give you a great finish. It's 3 or 4 coats sounds like a lot, but they go on so fast. No runs or drips. You don't have to worry about sags in the finish or anything because it soaks in, and it's so easy to apply 3 or 4 coats in a couple of days and you're done. So I'm going to put another coat on here, and I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to put 1 coat on the back here. 1, so it looks better, and 2, to prevent any or reduce any risk of warping due to one, drying out more on one side than the other. Plus it just makes it look better, look more finished. that's it. Took just a couple minutes to put another coat on, and that's certainly the advantage of wipe-on poly, is it only takes a few minutes to put on, and you don't really have to be careful about it. All right, so that's the second coat. I don't know if the camera can pick this up, but I mean, these are both walnut, but there's a fairly distinct difference in the color. This is a darker brown, and this is almost a little reddish. You get different colors from different boards, different trees, grown, you know, in different places. I guess they get different color from the minerals in the soil. And maybe from this angle you can definitely see the difference, where this is a darker brown and this is almost a reddish color. There's no stain on here. This is just the clear polyurethane wiped on the wood. Okay, so that wraps it up. I'll put one more coat on this before I give her the shelves. I'm going to have to think about if I need to give them some hardware to hang them, or whether they'll figure out how to hang them themselves. I'm afraid if I don't give them some hardware, they're going to put holes through them and screw them to the wall. I do have some hangers that I think I can give them, and that'll work pretty well. So, all right. Thanks for watching. I hope that you found some of this video interesting or informative. If you enjoyed it, appreciate a thumbs up and a like, and subscribe if you're not already subscribed to the channel. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment. We'll see you guys next time.